nana pua o Hawaiʻi Tupama hope o ka ʻāina Hiki mai
We're going to get started tonight. We're going to start off with a special performance by the Keao ʻāina. Again, we mahalo everybody for coming tonight. All of the proceeds of the tickets are donated to these 8 keiki and their 2 friends who aren't here yet. So on behalf of ʻāina, we appreciate you guys coming out and supporting Hawaiʻi Aloha ʻāina, but also supporting the Keao ʻāina. And one of the things that make us ʻokoʻa as a people, one of the things that make us different as a people, and that is our language. Nobody else speaks our language. No other place in the world speaks our language. So that's the one thing that we have going that nobody else can say they got going for us. So ʻokoʻa ka po makelaʻana. Without further ado, we'll bring up the Keao ʻāina to be making some added readings.
Aheo Hawaiʻi na kona, kona kaino kuai kalai, laila he ka haina o ka punana, punana leo a ona kona, kona mauna uli uli, kona mauna uluko, kuana ulu a kalana mauna. Eia oi Keao kaina, mana kona e ka wai ka umai, I ka naka o ka ohua, kuana I ka eka kukulu kea, pae mone I leo I ka moku kohula ie. Ahai ponoi.
So if you guys have saw that we had a panel set up and we're supposed to be come on and we're supposed to be here. We had a last minute change, but luckily I called Willy and told him of the change, and he was sitting with Keao, and so he offered to come in and take his place, and it actually works out really perfectly. And what we want to do tonight is basically give a foundation of what law ʻokoʻa is. For many of us here in Kona, we spent the past few years learning about law ʻokoʻa, learning that is a day of our independence, a day of our national identity, a day that we should celebrate, but we've been very busy learning about it. And now I think that we've come to the point where obviously there's enough of us here where we don't have to sit in a classroom style, but we can actually begin to celebrate law ʻokoʻa as well, while simultaneously continuing to ho'onui ike while also continuing to expand our knowledge on certain aspects of, what makes us ʻokoʻa as Hawaii. What are the things that set us apart from everybody? So, we're lucky tonight we have you got two doctors on my side. I'm a preschool teacher. We got Dr. Willy Kauai right here. We got Dr. Keao Nesmith right here. Kumu Keao was actually a kumu of mine for a class or two at my time at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Willy has done his research on Hawaiian citizenship and looking at that and basically looking at how that works with the continuity of the kingdom and so on and so forth. And so we're going to let him talk about Hawaiian nationality and citizenship. And Keao here is a kumu olelo Hawaii. He's done multiple works in translating and pushing our olelo and providing perhaps more venues, or not more venues, but more opportunities for us to access olelo Hawaii. So one of the popular stories that he's translated is actually the Hobbit. So many people have probably read that in olelo haole. Because of his work, we actually have the opportunity to read that in olelo Hawaii. And I look forward to the day that he translates all the Harry Potter books. So we can start incorporating that into, that's where I actually learned, I started reading Harry Potter at Kahoʻokahi actually. But it was in English. And so I'll pass it on to them and I'll let them do a better job of kind of introducing themselves and what they're going to talk about. But tonight basically I'm going to try and give you just a real quick preschool version of La ʻokoʻa, how it came to be, what is the mo'olelo of that if we don't know it, and then we're going to pass it on to Willy to talk about basically who are the people that celebrated La ʻokoʻa. And the answer is obvious, it'd be the citizens of that country that was ʻokoʻa. So who are those citizens? And then again, we'll kind of tie it in and look at basically the fact that our national identity started to fade away around the same time that our language started to fade away. And the connections between losing the language and losing the national identity while also revitalizing the language and hopefully in turn revitalizing a part of our national identity as well. So we're going to try our best to pull it all together. We've had very, very minimal planning, so let's get it started. La ʻokoʻa. Who has not heard of La ʻokoʻa before? Before tonight? Anybody not heard of it? Okay? No, that's why we're here. Alright, okay, so some of us don't know what La ʻokoʻa is. Many of us do, and that's why we're here to celebrate it. So I'm just going to give you again a real quick preschool version of La ʻokoʻa. So we're going to start with Kamehameha. Kamehameha ends his wars basically in 1795. He has all of the mokupuni except for Kauai. Okay, so from that point on, no war. He was fighting his wars with his weapons and his models. Eventually he started having cannons and muskets and so on and so forth. But basically, Kamehameha acquires Kauai through an agreement with Kauai in 1810. And Kamehameha, so from that point on, the islands are consolidated. We have Hawaiʻi ʻāina. And during this time is also we see the first Kanuha. Yeah, so before we had the couple system, everybody's living under that. And then I think it's in about 1782-ish or so. Maybe a little bit later. But during the time of Kamehameha, we have the first Kanuha, Kanuha Mamalohoe. And we know that as Ena Kanaka, Emalama Oko Ikeakua. Emalama Hoi Ike Kanaka Nuia, Meke Kanaka Iki, Eheleka, Elemakule, Kalohina, Meke Kama, Amoa Ikeala, Aohe Mena, Neho Opinikia, Heva no Make. Yeah, so that was basically the first law. He said, people, yeah, Malama Keakua. And I won't translate that word because there's a lot of translations of Akua. Take care of Akua. Also take care of the big man and the small man. May the old man, the old woman, and the child be able to safely access the walkways, the pathways without any fear of being harmed. Anybody who will bring harm upon these people will suffer the consequences of death. So, same thing like us. If the penalty for going 5 miles over the speed limit was death, nobody in this room would have a speeding ticket. So that worked. And then, so that's the first basis of a Kanuha in a sense. And now 1819, Kamehameha passes away. And he passes away at Kamakōholu. Now not even a year later, just a calendar year later, 1820, the first missionaries arrived to Hawaii. And so they bring this mana'o of Christianity, which again, Kamehameha was already familiar with in the time of Vancouver. But they bring in these, the first missionaries from the ABCFM. They come from New England. And a couple years later, we have writing that's formalized. And so we have a written language by about early 1820s, about 1822, 1823. And we start producing language. Olelo Hawaii in the Palapala. And so Kauai is born about 1813, 1814. And he takes the throne at the passing of his older brother, Liholiho. Liholiho is the son of Kamehameha. Liholiho travels to England in 1823. He's going to go ahead and kind of look at the mo'olelo and see what the scoops is with some of the relationships that Kamehameha has solidified with Great Britain. And they want to kind of confirm, what are these relationships? What are the terms of the protectorate, so on and so forth. And Liholiho and his wahine Kamamalu, they actually pass away in England, and they never make it back to Hawaii. So at that time, Kauai takes the throne. He's only about 11 years old. So obviously, we're not going to just throw the whole kingdom in his hands. Many of us have 11-year-old keiki, so incremental kuleana in a sense, yeah? But he was involved nonetheless. He was definitely involved. He was groomed for this. He was trained for this. And so, Ka'ahumanu is basically kind of the power one at that point. Kauai is kind of is helping where he can. And in about 1832, Ka'ahumanu passes away. And so Kauai at about age 15, takes an active role in leadership in government. And at the passing of Ka'ahumanu, he becomes the rightful king. And so he takes full control of the government. And so Kauai is seeing a lot of changes taking place in Hawaii. We have a lot of foreigners coming, we have a lot of influences, different people coming and going, and we're also getting news of things that are happening across the Pacific. So let's take it to 1839. 1839, we have the first Bill of Rights. And basically what Kauai does is he separates the Kanaka into three classes. And we have the Mo'i, and we have the Ali'i, and we have the Maka'ainana. And we see that later again in the Mahele as well, when they the interest is divided into thirds. And so we have Bill of Rights 1839. And so we started to see this transition in a sense, this progression towards a more Western style, not a Western style government, but one that could be recognized by a Western government. And so 1840, we have our first constitution. The constitution obviously is in Hawaiian as well as English. Hawaiian is the first language of the kingdom. And one of the clauses in the constitution, if you guys haven't read it, is that in order to take the throne, one must not be convicted of an infamous crime, what's the other one, something else, or be an idiot. What was it? Do you remember that? Yeah, not be convicted of an infamous crime or be an idiot. Yeah, so might be some people in the state of Hawaii that wouldn't fully meet those terms and regulations today in government, but we won't go there. Yeah, we cut them in half at least. But that was one of the clauses in the Constitution. So it's interesting to go ahead and read some of the language of our kupuna. But 1840, we have a Constitution. And so again, it's in Hawaiian and it's in English. It's the first Constitution of Hawaii. And so again, we continue to see this progression towards something that's more compatible to a Western style of government. And something that some of these world powers would be willing to recognize as a legitimate, sovereign, independent country capable of handling its own affairs. And so, in this same year, 1840, that's when the British actually go ahead and begin to colonize Aotearoa. And so we see what's happening in Aotearoa. And in 1842, we have the French going into the Marquesas and the Society Islands, going into Tahiti and colonizing those areas. So we're knowledgeable, we're understanding of what's happening, what's taking place to places similar to us, other island societies. And that we see that these other powers are coming in and taking over. And so we need to do something as a lahui to protect ourselves from these foreign invaders, from them coming in and snatching up all of our ʻāina, all of our everything that we have. Control of it. And so what Kauai does in 1842 is he dispatches 3 delegates. And he says that we're going to send 3 delegates and we're going to send them off to Great Britain, to France, and to America, and we're going to seek recognition of independence. We're going to attempt to get these governments and these monarchs to recognize us as a sovereign, independent country, basically on the same playing field, into the same, to be admitted to the same club in a sense as Great Britain, France, and America, the powers of the world. And so we sent out Timoteo Ha'alilio, who is a Kanaka. He's a good friend of Kauai since they were young kids. Timoteo goes out with William Richards, who came to Hawaii as a missionary. His primary purpose was to take the savages of Hawaii and turn them into a civilized people. And in turn, what he ended up doing was actually serving these so-called savages and taking Timoteo and being his servant, being his assistant on his ʻokoʻa. And Sir George Simpson, who was the president of the Hudson's Bay Company, he went off to Europe. And so they sent these delegates out. And again, the purpose is to solidify and secure recognition of Hawaiian independence. And so Timoteo and William Richards, they're going to go to America by way of Mexico. So they catch a ship to Mexico, they get to Mexico, and from Mexico they jump on mules. And they ride mules all the way across to DC, battling bouts of hunger, tough terrain, tough conditions, and then we're really going to see in the end the toll it took perhaps on Timoteo. But eventually they get to America. And they get to America, they're trying to secure a meeting with President Tyler. They want to secure a meeting, they want to begin this process of recognition of Hawaiian independence. And congressmen at that time, according to the Mo'olelo, don't seem to be too thrilled with the mission that Timoteo and William Richards have been sent on. Obviously, America has interest in Hawaii, as do these other countries. And so we're going to use those interests to our advantage. And we're going to use that to kind of politically punch them, in a sense. And so Timoteo and William Richards, they plant this rumor quite tactfully in Congress, and they say that if America is not willing and ready to recognize as a sovereign independent country, we're more than prepared to go under the control and the power of protection of Great Britain. Now again, America doesn't want to lose us to Great Britain, Great Britain doesn't want to lose us to America. They all have interest in Hawaii, so better than one claiming us against the other, it'd be best for us to be independent. So that rumor starts to spread throughout Congress, and before we know it, our delegates have secured a meeting with President Tyler. And so at that meeting, there's discussions, and he basically assures them that America recognizes Hawaii as an independent country. There's no need to go ahead and proceed further with the written treaty or document, but that they look forward to Hawaii continuing this process towards independence. So it's a step in the right direction. And so that's secured. So now we're going to we're going to make our way over to Europe, where Sir George Simpson was already, he was already there, put in his mo'olelo. And so we get there, and then we're assured the same thing from representatives from Great Britain as well as representatives from France. And they say that we recognize Hawaii as an independent country, and in time, we'll go ahead, we'll follow through the process, and eventually we'll have a formal treaty. But up until this time, it's just basically verbal recognition. But it steps in the right direction. And so they continue their discussions, they continue their meetings, and again, the preschool version story is on November 28th, 1843, at the Court of London. Representatives from the British government as well as the French government, they signed a treaty, which today we know as the Anglo-Franco Proclamation, and they signed a treaty recognizing Hawaii as an independent and sovereign country, the first non-European country in the world to be recognized as a sovereign independent country. I think before every single country that wants to build TNT on Mauna Kea. We were recognized before they were. China, Japan, India, Canada. Canada came from Great Britain. So only America was a country before us. But we became the first non-European country in the world. 1843, November 28, 1843. Hawaii, the first non-European country in the world. Again, before some of these people that are world powers now. And only 24 years after Kamehameha's passing. Yeah? So huge transitions, huge changes, and Hawaii wasn't necessarily trying to attempt to keep up with the world. Hawaii was setting the standard, Hawaii was setting the trend, and Hawaii set an example for many countries to follow and seeking independence. And so that's basically where we are today. I'm going to pass it over to Willy and allow him to continue from there, because we understand that the current implication, the current situation that we're in. So that's the mo'olelo of ʻokoʻa. November 28, 1843, Hawaii recognized as the first non-European country in the world. We continue to celebrate that day today due to certain circumstances, and I'm going to pass it on to Willy to continue us. Mahalo.
My name is Willy Kauai. I come from the island of Maui. Born and raised there in a place called Anybody heard the famous words Kahoʻokahi Paniolo. That's where I'm from. Daddy was a third generation Hawaiian cowboy. Was born and raised there. Just a little bit of my background and how I got to where I am at today. Ended up going to public school. Like many of you, I learned absolutely nothing about any of this kind of history that we're now celebrating today. For those of you that can recall the moments and times in which you took Hawaiian history in public school, right? And I'm pretty sure that it's almost still the same today. Right? The Department of Education, I believe you're required to take 3 full semesters of Hawaiian history, right? 1 semester in 4th grade, 1 semester in 7th grade, and 1 semester in 9th grade. However, those history lessons, I think strategically left out significant moments in our history. Whenever you talk about Hawaiian history, there's kind of 2 places in which that history starts. One is when the United States shows up in 1898 and it illegally annexed Hawaii. And the second one is usually Pearl Harbor, right, 1941. Those are kind of the 2 main places in which our understanding of Hawaiian history starts. Of course, as we're now starting to uncover now, our history is much more deeper than that. It's much more rich than that. And I think a celebration like this, I think this is something that also should be pointed out as well too, is that it wasn't too long ago when we didn't celebrate this event, right? This is something that's happening right now in real time, right? So there's change happening right in front of our eyes, and I think this is definitely a reflection of that change. To see Keiki running around with James Kaulia's shirt on and his famous words, I think again is very much evidence of that change. I ended up going to the university. The only reason why I ended up going to college, right, in 1898 after I graduated from Maui High School, is not necessarily to earn a college degree, right? But if you come from upcountry Maui, one of the reasons that you're going to go to Honolulu is to see the bright city lights. And so that was the intent. Of course, when you get there, you have to show something to your ohana that you're doing something. So I ended up enrolling at Kapiolani Community College. I think I limped out of high school with a 1.8 GPA. Really had no kind of interest in who I was. But you go to college and you learn how to do something that nobody taught me before how to do, right? And that's this magnificent thing called thinking critically, right? Ended up going to the University of Hawaii in 2003. I get a bachelor's degree. 2006, I ended up getting a master's degree in political science, and in 2014, I just finished a PhD in political science as well too. Currently, I'm the director of Native Hawaiian Student Services at UH Manoa. We provide financial and academic services to all 3,000 Native Hawaiians that attend UH Manoa. That number 3,000 sounds like a lot. But we represent maybe a little less than about 13% of the student body population at UH Manoa. And that's the highest it's ever been, right? So we're talking about not knowing this history. There's a system that was put in place that denied us, right? That didn't allow us to get this information, right? The famous word is education is power, right? We were left out of that ability to become powerful, if you will. I think just to provide a little bit more context, when we talk about Hawaiians in higher education as well too. When I started my PhD in 2006, there was less than 50 Native Hawaiians in the world that held a PhD, right? Again, very problematic. That means that we're not developing research. That means that we're not developing scholarship, right? That means that we're not an influence in these places in which we need to become influential to educate us and our people. I am happy to say that those numbers at the University of Hawaii at Manoa are definitely on the rise, right? And so we're starting to see a change. Even when we look at faculty at UH Manoa, When I first started going to UH Manoa, there was only a few pockets, right, within the university in which you could go to learn about yourself, to learn about your history, essentially to learn more about your identity, right? And those places were usually Hawaiian studies, Hawaiian language. Those are the only places in which you could find Hawaiian faculty, right, that could basically teach you about yourself. Today, Hawaiian faculty at the University of Hawaiʻi Manoa is somewhere around 3%. 3%. Right? Those are shocking numbers. Very shocking numbers. With that said, there's about 200 Native Hawaiian faculty now at UH Manoa. And we're not just in Hawaiian language anymore. We're not just in just Hawaiian studies, but we're spread across throughout the campus, right? And so having Hawaiian faculty in these kinds of places is developing space, right, for our next generations, essentially to learn more about themselves. Moving into my research, so I looked at the topic of Hawaiian citizenship. Now, show of hands, does anybody learn about Hawaiian citizenship in any kind of educational setting that they went to while growing up? Probably not, right? Probably not. If you go to another country, right, such as America, there is thousands of books written on the topic of American citizenship and how it evolved, right? There's thousands of journal articles that you can find on the topic of American citizenship. When it comes to Hawaiian citizenship, right, this is the topic that I decided to take on. There's none. Yeah, none. No book, no article on this topic. One of the things that really kind of pushed me into this research is kind of my own personal experience as a Hawaiian, right? Negotiating this thing called Hawaiian identity. I'm born to a Hawaiian father and a white mother whose fair skin I adopted. And that created a lifetime of conflict, right? Now imagine Willy, Kauai, running around Ulupalakua, which was primarily Hawaiian. Right? Dark-skinned Hawaiians, like my father was. I would constantly be asked the question, who's your family? People would think that I was the family of the owners of the ranch, the urban family. And I'd say, no, my father is Andrew Kauai Sr. And even then, people still wouldn't believe that. But one thing that you're guaranteed, right, to be asked, if you're growing up in Hawaii, there's two questions that you're guaranteed to be asked. The one is, what school you grad, and the other is, what are your nationalities? Yeah. And for me, right, whenever this question of nationality comes up, or for many of us today, the common response is to rattle off all of the multi-ethnic, all of the ethnicities that we have. Yeah. And whenever you declare, right, so for me, I only knew dad to be Hawaiian, my grandparents to be Hawaiian, mom was white. But whenever you declare that you're Hawaiian, there's always a follow-up question. What is the follow-up question? How much Hawaiian do you? And in this sense, right, the asker, the person who's asking the question, what kind of response are they looking for? How do they want you to measure your Hawaiian? In what kind of metric? Blood quantum, right? Blood quantum. Blood quantum is always the response. For me, right, even though I only knew dad to be Hawaiian, never gonna tell anybody, oh, I'm 50% Hawaiian. Because that's gonna raise even more questions, right? People are gonna interrogate my identity even more. So for me, my common response was, whenever I would declare to be Hawaiian, I'm about 20%. And even still, yeah, people would still question that, right? Because of the color of my skin. These kind of personal encounters pushed me into my research. Where I started looking at how identity worked prior to US occupation, right? Prior to the illegal annexation of Hawaii in 1898, how did understandings of identity work, right? In the 19th century, in the Hawaiian Kingdom, the term Hawaiian had a completely different meaning than the one that we're used to today, right? When we talk about the term Hawaiian today, we're usually talking about it in the sense of ethnicity, in the sense of blood, in the sense of race, right? All of these meanings and definitions, however, right, these don't come out of the Hawaiian Kingdom. These don't come out of the 19th century. These are identity markers, right, that come as a result of America's occupation of Hawaii, right? One of the first instances in which you see that term Hawaiian being used to describe race or even blood quantum, right, is the 1921 Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, right? But prior to that, in the 19th century Hawaiian Kingdom, the term Hawaiian didn't denote race, it didn't denote ethnicity, it denoted nationality or citizenship to the country, right? The term Hawaiian was a politically inclusive term, right? There was three basic ways in which you could acquire Hawaiian citizenship in the Hawaiian Kingdom. The first was by being, and this is all coming out. Kahoʻokahi had just mentioned the kingdom's transition from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, right? One of the things that you see in that transition for the first time is that people have rights, right? The common people, the citizenry, have rights. Prior to that, the only kind of political voice that was being put forward was that from the elite, right? Now with the coming of the constitutional monarchy, now you have a democratic system being put in place. Now rights are being given, now a political voice is being given to all the makaʻainana, right? The Hawaiian citizenry. And what's so unique about this transition, right? In all other countries in the world, in order for people to get rights, right, from the king or from the queen, and this was happening all across Europe and Britain and France, either the king or the queen's head had to roll, right? You had to cut off the king's head, cut off the queen's head. That's how people were getting rights, right? That's how the French Republic came about. In the Hawaiian Kingdom, there was a bloodless revolution. Kamehameha III, right? He voluntarily divested his power as an absolute monarch, right? As an absolute monarch to create a constitutional system. And that's very strategic, right? But it also shows you, I think, when you see the strategy that was being employed, you can see how smart and diplomatic they were, right? As Kahoʻokahi was mentioning, all throughout the Pacific there's gunboat diplomacy. Basically you had big foreign countries, bullies, rolling up to small island nations, pointing their guns at the king or the queen and demanding, right, certain demands. By creating a constitutional system, right, no longer can you just take out the king, right, and take over the whole country, right? Now you have a separation of powers. Now the king is no longer the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive all in one. With the creation of a constitutional system, right, now that power is separated, it's divested, it's out of the hands of one person. Something that they needed to do. Anyways, with the creation of this constitutional system, 1848 first constitution, 1845 to about 1848 is where the legislature goes to work, right? For those 3 years, they compile almost about 800 pages of law, statutes, right? Through debates, through the things that you do in a legislature when you're creating laws. One of the things that is created, right, out of these 1845 statutes is citizenship laws. Now, the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1845, mind you, becomes one of the first countries in the world to adopt universal racial suffrage, meaning that regardless of the color of your skin, right, anybody could vote. Anybody had a political voice. There's 3 ways in which you could acquire Hawaiian citizenship at this time. The first was by being born on the soil of the king, right? The second was through a principle called jus sanguinis, right? Parentage. So if one of your parents was a Hawaiian national, you could also acquire Hawaiian citizenship or nationality. And the third was naturalization. There was a process in which people who were coming from abroad could naturalize and become Hawaiian subjects and be afforded all the rights therein. I'll give you an example of how inclusive this was, right? And how progressive we were when it comes to citizenship. You had slaves coming from the American South, escaping the grips of slavery, right? These are former slaves, finding their way to the shores of Hawaii, naturalizing and becoming Hawaiian subjects, right? These are former slaves that now have a political voice. They now have civil rights. First black man to come to Hawaii during this time, Anthony Allen, Anthony Allen, former slave, finds his way to Hawaii, naturalizes, becomes a Hawaiian subject, and experiences all the social mobility therein. Has a political voice, has civil rights, right? He even becomes, here's a great trivia question if you ever ask this. Who is the first person to own a resort in Waikiki? Anthony Allen, a former slave, right? To give you an idea of the kind of social mobility that people of color had in the kingdom. And now you would ask yourself, why was that? Why was the kingdom so progressive when it came to citizenship? Well, because the people that were running the country were also people of color as well too, right? With the Hawaiian Kingdom, you had the Aboriginal population always comprised the majority of the Hawaiian citizenry, right? And therefore, they usually always also comprise the majority in the legislature, those creating laws. And you see this evolve all the way until about 1887, right? 1887, you have the creation of the Bayonet Constitution. The Bayonet Constitution, of course, is right at the beginning. When you're seeing people like Thurston and Dole are starting to take control, or wanting to take control of the Hawaiian government, right? And they're doing that by creating a revolution. One of the things that's not talked about enough, I think, is it wasn't just the Aboriginal population that was fighting back against Thurston and Dole, right? It was a multi-ethnic effort, right? In the sense that you had Aboriginal Hawaiians and also Chinese Hawaiians and also Japanese Hawaiians standing shoulder to shoulder to fight for their country, right? To fight for this kind of rise of white supremacy in the Hawaiian Kingdom, if you will, right? This multi-ethnic population in the 19th century was very powerful. And when you think about it in the scale of the rest of the world, right? When you look at the United States, the Hawaiian Kingdom has inclusive citizenship rights, right? If you look at the United States, in order to be an American citizen, from the creation of the American Constitution all the way until about 1950, right? There was one prerequisite. You had to be white, right? So people of color weren't afforded political rights, right? In the United States. This is still a huge issue today in the United States. We were way beyond that, right? We were way beyond these arguments of race. Another example, you look at the Chinese experience in Hawaii, right? Now we often hear about the Chinese experience in the Hawaiian Kingdom through discussions of the plantation. The one thing that we don't talk about enough is the Chinese that walked out of the cane fields and into the economic center of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Before the overthrow happens, the ethnic group that had the most business licenses in the kingdom were the Chinese, right? The Chinese were also naturalizing, becoming Hawaiian subjects, Hawaiian citizens, and taking full advantage of those rights, right? So when the kingdom goes through this peril, right, in the 1890s, the Chinese are standing shoulder to shoulder next to the Aboriginal population. Why? Because becoming a part of the United States for an ethnic group like the Chinese would mean that you would be subject to anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Asian laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? The Chinese, again, very politically vested into this country we call the Hawaiian Kingdom. 1887 with the Bayonet Constitution, 1893 with the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the government, 1898 with the illegal annexation, right? It wasn't just, I reiterate this point again, it wasn't just the Aboriginal population that was fighting. It was a multi-ethnic national population that was fighting back. When the United States comes in 1898, they bring their ideologies, right? They bring their own experiences of race and plant it in Hawaii, right? One of the things I think that people also don't don't realize as well too is all the infrastructure, right? All the infrastructure that we see around Hawaii today, from the Department of Education, from the police department, the fire department, our public healthcare system, the judiciary, the legislature, all of these institutions that we have, right, or that exist with us today, these are not American inventions. These are all institutions. All of these institutions were all here before the United States got here, right? So when we're talking about a huli, or if we're talking about this grand kind of change, right, we're just really talking about a change in administration. Right? Dr. Keao talks about this in the sense of the analogy of a carjacking, right, or hijacking. He said, basically, what made the occupation so easy for the United States is all they had to do was go in and change the heads of every single one of these departments, right? The head of the Department of Education, the head of the public healthcare system, the head of the police department, the head of the fire department. That's what made it so easy. One of the things that was so damaging, right? One of the things that was so damaging and why I think we're seeing change today is when they took over the Department of Education. Right? When they took over the Department of Education, they did so with the intention of obliterating our memory, our recollection of our history, especially when it comes to important events such as ʻokoʻa. Today it's exciting, right? This is not the only gathering that's happening across the Hawaiʻi Aloha ʻāina, right? With regard to ʻokoʻa. Even as we speak right now, I heard there's a celebration in Kamehameha, there's a celebration in Puna. There's many celebrations that are happening, and it's because we're starting to recover our understanding of our past, our history. It's powerful. And that's having a profound effect on empowering us today, right? Knowing our history is bringing us definitely a sense of empowerment. One of the things that I also tasked, and I'll leave it with this, one of the things that I was also tasked with in my dissertation was responding to the question, okay, if we've been under illegal occupation for the last 123 years, right, since 1898, right, who then comprises the Hawaiian national citizenry today? Who are the Hawaiian subjects today? And remember, we're not gonna use the American definition of who is a Hawaiian, because that always goes back to race. That gets us in trouble. That's an issue that we don't need to deal with right now, right? To answer that question, we look back at how our country used to do it in the 19th century. How did the Hawaiian Kingdom handle it, right? Hawaiian citizenship, multi-ethnic, like I had mentioned. So in answering that question, who comprises the Hawaiian national population today? If you can trace your ancestry to a Hawaiian subject, right, that was a Hawaiian subject before the occupation began on August 12, 1898, you're also considered a Hawaiian subject today. When this occupation ends, and it will, when this occupation ends, right, it's going to be those people that comprise the Hawaiian national population. And again, it's going to be multi-ethnic. And again, the Aboriginal population will be the majority. This analysis on citizenship has profound implications, right? This analysis of citizenship is not just important for historical purposes, right? This analysis of citizenship has legal and political ramifications today. One example we can point out is this. Where was President Barack Obama born? Hawaii, right? Now if we look at simple international law, right, the law of occupation, it's a whole entire discourse that talks about how you define citizenship within an occupied state. One of the things that cannot happen is that you cannot acquire citizenship in an occupied country, right? So for example, anybody who was born in Hawaii after August 12, 1898 retains the citizenship or nationality of their parents. Okay. Now if you think of all of those people, right, here's another example. Before I get into Barack Obama, Senator Daniel Inouye. Senator Daniel Inouye is born in Hawaii in 1925. Not in the territory of Hawaii, but in the occupied country of Hawaii. Right? Simple international law again. Daniel Inouye cannot claim to be an American citizen by virtue of his birth in the state of Hawaii. So what does that mean? This 6th-term senator, right, that served in Congress for more than 35 years, did so as a Japanese national, not an American citizen. This is just simple international analysis. Now Barack Obama, this goes all the way to the highest levels of US government. Barack Obama, this is why education is important. Barack Obama, when he was going back up for election in 2012, right, you had a bunch of white Republicans, primarily ultra-conservatives, saying that Barack Obama cannot be the president of the United States because he's not an American, he's not a natural-born citizen. In order to hold the office of president and the office of vice president, right, this is straight U.S. constitutional law, you have to be a natural-born subject. In order to be a natural-born subject, you have to be born in one of the 49 states. Hawaii is occupied. Right? You also, this movement, they call themselves the birthers, right? You had people like Donald Trump who was sending people down to the Department of Health, trying to pull this idea that Barack Obama wasn't born here, and he was born in Kenya. Right? The reason why Barack Obama cannot be president today is not because he was born in Kenya, but because he was born in an occupied country, right? A place that the United States has never, ever, ever been able to show legal title to. Right? Still to this day, the United States has never been able to show legal title to Hawaii. This has profound, profound ramifications. Right? This is just the topic of citizenship. Right? This is but one research project. Right? And to be honest, my research on citizenship cannot be the only one. We need to have at least another 30 people doing more research on just this topic of citizenship. And again, mind you, that's one. It is exciting also to say that this information, right, when we talk about the existence of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the continued existence of the Hawaiian Kingdom, when we talk about issues and topics such as citizenship, when we talk about occupation, you're starting to see a lot more of this research emerge from the University of Hawaii. I believe just within the last 8 years, there's been about 10 Hawaiians that have come out with PhDs on this topic. That's empowering. That's empowering. And especially when this information gets out to the most important people, which is the community. So, with that said, I talk too much, I think, and I'll stop there. And, so we'll have time for some questions and answers when this is done. But mahalo for listening, and I'll pass this over to you.
Ano ay kapukaulua o erohan na makua, na pomo, na keiki o kona kai opo i kalai, ka pewa au ka manini, kia nima i ka eka, ho'ulu, ho'opulu, i ka puahi nalo o nā kona, aloha kākou. O kei o Keao, my name is Keao, Nesmith, I'm from Kekaha, Kauai. We say ka moku ka'ilila, the last island we get to snatch the sun. Just like you guys get to see the most beautiful sunsets over here on this island, on my side we get to see the last sunset in the Hawaiʻi Aloha. So these are the kinds of little snippets of olelo that I encourage all of us Kanaka to be able to be ready to say, to represent your ʻāina, because I know my ʻāina, and because I know these little olelo about my ʻāina. Because for kupuna, who are people who are native speakers of Hawaiian, when you say little things like that, they giggle, you know, because they think it's so cute that you would know these little snippets. Kona kai opua I kalai. These are words that you hear in the songs, and you are Kona people. So when you go someplace and you say, somebody asks you, well, who are you? And you say, I'm Kona kai opua I kalai. That's the kind of thing that will tickle the heart of many kupuna on all the islands, because you're able to say that. So one of the beautiful things about Punana Leo is this is where that learning happens. And so malo kia kua, malo noi no keia Punana Leo. And I want to say that it warms the heart of Okumu to see one of your amana do good. And all of you Kona people should be very proud that Kahoʻokahi is from among you. I am dovetailing on the what is being put out on the table tonight, and I also want to say mahalo loa for your attention. And it's impressive that like Willy and also Kahoʻokahi was mentioning earlier that this has never happened before. Just last year, the year before, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, to talk about Hawaii as an independent country today, even our own people think of you as crazy. And today, now we start talking like this, still get people looking at us like we're crazy. That's okay. Next year they're going to be right here with us. So we're not crazy, just to let you know. So my field is O-level. I got my doctorate at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. I felt it was very important for me to get out of the forest so I could see head trees. And I had to go to New Zealand in order to experience that. And to me, that was probably the only way I can conceive that I could have pulled off the kinds of things that I pulled off. So my area is linguistics, particularly language teaching, theory, and practice. The best, most interactive, fun ways to replicate a real, genuine first language experience, but in an artificial setting, which is, in our case, most cases, is a classroom. Our language situation is in such bad shape right now that really it is now the burden of the classroom to educate our people in a language that we have a birthright to at home. And there is a direct parallel and correlation between what Kahoʻokahi was talking about with our ʻokoʻa, our independent status as a nation, and with what Willy was talking about with this programming that was imposed upon us to break it out of us. And we are now, in 2015, are the result of that program. And so I prepared some notes because I wanted to be sure that I stay on point. But I'm going to start by talking about 1927. 1927. Remember 1927. How many of us, we remember the last person in each of our own ohana who was a native speaker of Hawaiian? Native speaker meaning they were born and raised, that was their first language, their parents, that was their first language, their parents, that was their first language of the home, except that's a native speaker. For how many of us it was our own mom and dad, mom or dad, who was the last native speaker in our family? Raise your hand, mom or dad. For how many of us it was any one of our grandparents? Raise your hand. A few more numbers, a few more hands. For how many of us it was our great-grandparents who was the last native speaker in our families? Great-grandparent. And more again. And as I go back further and further, more hands go up. Because we are physically able to see how much we've been separated from our language. Because the last person in our family who was a real native speaker died. That's it. Everyone from that moment on, only English and Pidgin. That's all. Not Hawaiian. We wish we could talk Hawaiian. Now, But in my family, my grandma was born in Honuapo, Ka'u, and raised in a peony grass house in Puna, in Kehena. She took me in. So she has 11 kids, 8 girls, 3 boys, my mom, and made the same decision everyone else of her generation when they first started having babies did, which was, I don't want my children to suffer. In other words, being Hawaiian is equal to suffering. Speaking Hawaiian is equal to shame. Knowing Hawaiian culture is equal to, I'm not as good as these white people. That was the generation where that thinking was the thinking and what they considered the only smart way to think. Because of that decision they made, they were sassy. You know why? They could speak both languages. They spoke Hawaiian as a first language and they learned to speak English. Anybody in a position like that, you can get cocky, yeah? Oh, I speak both. Yeah, to me it's nothing. My kids though have no choice. My mom and her generation had no choice in the matter. They didn't know both languages, they only knew the one. As they grew up in the mid-1900s. And for them, they were doing the thing, they were the smart ones. They were the smart ones because they only speak English. The generation before them, my grandma's generation, tried to protect them by saving them from shame. And to their thinking, being Hawaiian, speaking Hawaiian was shame. So it was this next generation, my parents' generation, who was somehow cured of their Hawaiianness. So the problem is, people cannot really predict the future yet. My mama had kids, you know, me, and the rest of us. We are the ones screaming for our language. How come we cannot speak Hawaiian? It's not that generation, it's us who is screaming, how come I cannot speak Hawaiian? Why do I feel so deprived that I was cut off from my language and my culture, the practices, all everything, all that knowledge? I wanted that. But we weren't alive with our grandparents when they were having kids to yell at them. Don't think like that. That's how I feel. You know, I get upset when I go too far. 1927. Remember the year 1927. This is why. We had several Hawaiian language newspapers in regular circulation throughout the 1800s. Over 50 different. Now we only get one. Only get the Star Advertiser. That's the only one. Had 50. I mean, we get the Hawaii Tribune Herald. I'm from Kauai. We get the Garden Island. So that means we get 2. We get 2. Had over 50 Hawaiian language newspapers that were available. Everybody could go buy it, 25 cents, 10 cents, whatever. 1927, there is one newspaper called Nupepaku ʻokoʻa, the independent newspaper. And it was around from the mid-1800s all the way to 1927. And this is their final word. This is the column heading, the heading of the column. Keia kaheluhope o ka Nupepaku ʻokoʻa. This is the last publication of the Nupepaku ʻokoʻa. It says, Erike me ia hoʻike ia koe ma ka puli hala no ka hoʻopau ia o ka hoʻopuka anaku I ka Nupepaku ʻokoʻa ma ke ia poʻaha. No rila o ke ia kona puka hope ana a nalo wale aku ia. Ma ke ala hele o na Nupepa Hawaii ia pau I ho ea mai I ko la kumo o pena. Just as it was reported last week about the end of the publication of Nupepaku ʻokoʻa this Thursday, therefore, this is the last issue of this newspaper, and it will disappear, going the way of all Hawaiian language newspapers before, who have come to their demise. The next paragraph. He mea minamina ka ike ana I ke kahi Nupepa ka I koloa I pai ia a hopuka ia no nā makahiki he kanaono a oi ma ka aulelo makua hini a kalahui Hawaii e nalohia kuana mai na homea ko na Hawaii a kana e rike me ko E like me ke ko ana o Keao o ka manawa, ua hiki ole ia kākou ke aloha e. It is sad to see another old Hawaiian language newspaper disappear. Having been printed and published for over 60 years in the Hawaiian language among our Hawaiian people, and is now disappeared. And has now disappeared from the homes of Hawaiians. But as we can see, we cannot help. It cannot be avoided. We cannot help. Mai kahoʻokahi anaku ia e hia moi no ka manawa maulua, because we have let it fall asleep. No ke kumu e ni mau nei ke kamairio ia a me ka helehelu ia o ka ʻōlelo Hawaii I loko ke ia manawa e nei. Because as we see, Hawaiian is no longer being spoken. Hawaiian is no longer being read and amongst us in this day and age going forward. 1927, alarms and whistles are already going off that our language is dying, is disappearing. Why? Because people are not speaking it anymore. So this is that generation. My grandma was born in 1912. And she started, her first baby was when she was 14 years old. So her first of 11 kids. So she is among this generation that is being recorded here who made that decision, we're not going to speak Hawaiian. Why? Because all of the institutions that would support society no longer existed. We no longer have fire chiefs who speak Hawaiian like us. They're not like us anymore. We have no longer teachers who speak Hawaiian like us. They don't exist. They speak another language. We don't have administrators of any department who speak Hawaiian like us. They've been switched out with these other foreigners. So we need to remember also going further back in time, so that was 1927. There were already alarm bells going off even before 1927. 1893 was the coup that overthrew the government of Queen Willy. 1892, there was this report. It says, everyone conversed, now this is there were also English language newspapers, and this is what. Everyone conversant with the desire of the Hawaiian parents at the present time will readily understand that the fate of common schools is foredoomed. Common schools were these schools in Hawaii in 1892, all ʻōlelo Hawaii. Not all ʻōlelo Hawaii. There were a few English schools, and Hawaiian parents were sending their kids to English schools. Why? Were they worried that Hawaiian was going to disappear? No. Everyone spoke Hawaiian. From the government, all aspects of government, all aspects of society already were native speakers, completely fluent. They wanted their kids at that time to learn this foreign language that would assist them as subjects of the kingdom who go out to other countries. And so English was that for them. So here in 1892, the government is already getting nervous. Too many people are starting to do this. Where it has been practicable, the change has been made according to the wishes of the parents, but in many cases it is impracticable. Small villages such as Makalawena, Ohihaile, Palawa, or Waimanu can rarely be supplied with teachers from outside. So parents are asking for more English teachers to be teachers at their local schools. There are many more schools because you cannot go too far yet unless you get donkey. So they're looking, the parents are wanting to have English teachers already. The teacher employed must belong to the village because that's all you get. And they were kind of mina because the ones that get is the ones that don't really speak English. No indication is provided, however, as to the thinking or the rationale of the parents preferring English medium education in this report. Whether out of an opinion that English medium education was superior to Hawaiian medium education, or whether there was no concern that they would lose Hawaiian because that was the language of the home. Because as soon as post-school, everything else is in Hawaiian, because that's our world. Case in point, ni hau. I come from Kauai on the far west side, in our moku of Kona. The people typical ni hao, which from my house, ni hao is just right there. There are about 100 people or so that live on ni hao at any time in the year. Christmas time, plenty of people go home ni hao because they make big party. Then they come back Kauai. The vast majority of ni hao people don't live on ni hao, they live in my hometown. That's all my neighbors. So perhaps 300 ni hao people. The school on ni hao, there is one school, is not a Hawaiian immersion school. They don't want Hawaiian immersion education on ni hao because of this same reason. They already speak Hawaiian. They want their kids to be smart in English so that they can function, get a job. Growing up, plenty times, my neighbors come to my house. I'm in high school yet, and parents of my neighbors come knock on my door and they get one paper in their hand and they're asking me for help in Hawaiian because they cannot read this job application. So, or a tax form, or a change of address form from the post office. They cannot, they don't know what it's saying. So they come to my house, knock on my door, Keao, you can help me fill out this form. Oh, okay, so I fill out the form for them. They want their kids to speak English in that kind of setting. Because at home, it's all Hawaiian. Everybody, adults, babies, for babies, it's their first language. Even now, in my hometown. So that was the context. It's not that they wanted to give up Hawaiian, but come 1927, the story had changed. The context in 1927 was entirely different at that point. There was pressure, external pressure. So, this is a section that comes out of my PhD paper. The political upheavals in the Hawaiian Kingdom that began in 1893, including the breakup of the royal court and its impact on the prestige of elevated Hawaiian speech, like big speeches, formal language, worked to completely transform the social, political, and linguistic landscape of the Hawaiian Islands, leading to a situation in which by the end of the 20th century, so by the end of the 1900s, it is likely that there are significantly fewer than 1,000 native speakers of Hawaiian left. Kona was, as I was growing up, you can, we'll talk about places in the Hawaiian Islands where still get Hawaiian speakers. You would list out places like Kalapana, had families where had, speakers of Hawaiian, older people. The other place, Kona, up here, up Mauka, all along over here. Several, and I met several of them. All gone now. They're all gone right now. Oahu, quite a few. Kauai, quite a few. Today, all gone. 1, 2 left. You cannot call them a community anymore. Ni'ihau people, that is a community of Hawaiian speakers, native speakers. Outside of the Ni'ihau community, gone like the dinosaurs. Gone. However, by the end of the 21st, among the Hawaiian language teachers today, just among teachers who have been in the business for a while, it is regularly discussed that there are fewer than 500 native speakers left. However, by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, there may have been as many as 2,000 or 3,000 people who learned to speak Hawaiian as a second language because they went to a classroom. So now we have completely flipped the numbers from where everyone in the Hawaiian Kingdom was a speaker of our national language, not even by choice, that was our first language, everyone, to a switch in, remember 1927, alarms and whistles going off because people are stopping speaking Hawaiian. So now, today, when someone, no matter who it is, speaks Hawaiian, almost 100% of the time, it's because they went to one classroom to learn it. This has created a new kind of branding, a new kind of Hawaiian, if you want, that in many ways is very different than the Hawaiian of our native speakers. The Hawaiian our kupuna actually spoke. Why? Is it our fault? Absolutely not. We are English speakers as our first language. So we try to grasp the Olelo Hawaii, but we stop thinking English. That's not our fault. It's a consequence of our history. And so we try to fill in the gaps of knowledge in Na'olelo by making stuff up. To make it conform to English because I'm comfortable thinking in English, that's my first language. That is the condition our language is in right now. So essentially, we have to talk about the Olelo Hawaii community as being in two parts. One, are native speakers entirely gone? Have they all disappeared like dinosaurs? No, a'ale, a'ale, still get it. And they will always be native speakers until they disappear. So the last guarantee will be our Niihau people. Apart from them, you have an entire community now, thousands of people now, who are second language speakers and speak it differently because we stuck thinking English. And that's not our fault. But it's us being honest about this discussion of our history that we've been talking about here that makes it okay. Because it is not our fault. This is a consequence of our history, and we claim our ʻokoʻa, we claim our identity, we claim our language, even if it means maintaining together a course for our olelo that we went to the pier and the ship left. Two guys, they went. We're standing there holding the bags and the ship left already. So what we're going to do? We're going to sit here and cry and do nothing? No, we're going to do something. So we're going to do something with our language. That's going to happen and has been happening. So, okay, so the Cleveland Illegal Colony Agreement consists of many things. Apology, not like the Clinton apology, that was rubbish. That was complete rubbish. The Cleveland Illegal Colony consisted of President Cleveland of the US, as a result of the coup that toppled the government of Queen Illegal Colony. That agreement that they created is an international binding bilateral treaty between two independent states. That is the thing we need to, any kind of other distractions that come up, we're gonna make vote, we're gonna make reservation. No, Cleveland and the ʻOkalani agreement took care of all that. Everything was taken care of. President Cleveland he felt bad. He actually felt bad. He wasn't a bad person. He felt bad and said, drafted it up in black and white, on behalf of the United States of America, we apologize to Queen ʻOkalani and the Hawaiian Kingdom for what took place on that day in 1893. And we will fully repay your government for all damages that were incurred that we were party to. That is reparations, and it was written into the Cleveland ʻOkalani agreement. So that is an instrument of international law called remedial justice. That's what states do between states, is they fess up and make reparations to correct the wrong that was done. The Hawaiian Kingdom is entitled to remedial justice. Reparations promised in the 1893 Cleveland ʻOkalani Agreement as line items in the total monetary reparation payment or package. I estimate that it will cost at least $100 million in the first year alone to develop a coordinated language maintenance and teacher training program at the national level, from Hilo to Niihau, with perhaps up to $1 billion in reparations to each family whose kupuna decided to stop speaking Hawaiian because of the Americanization program that was going on. This is a copy of, it says, the program for patriotic exercise in the public schools territory of Hawaii, dated 1906. And what it says in here, this is one of many official documents to Americanize Hawaiian subjects and residents of here. In it says, now school teachers and children were taught through daily rituals. You guys remember daily rituals at elementary school? What we do? Our experience? Yeah, pledge allegiance to the flag. So in my area of linguistics, yeah, there's a saying, there's kind of it's almost like a language dies not with the last speaker of that language. It dies with the second to the last speaker. Why? Because the last speaker is the one who's about to. Hallelujah.
Okay, well, we're pretty much just about on schedule. We're running about 7 minutes behind. So we have a little bit of time. If there's any questions from the audience, we'll start time for the 2-minute answers. Is there any questions anybody has about anything from the founding of ʻokoʻa to citizenship and nationality to coinciding with the loss of our language, or any other matter? We get 2 doctors over here. We can talk this time. We don't know about that. Anyone know? Any questions? Yo.
I have a question for Willy. I have a question about citizenship and nationality. I totally get the whole concept about Hawaiian nationalism and how it's not going to focus everything on people. So today we're recognizing Hawaiians because we have blood versus non-Hawaiians. You're sort of saying like the Americans way to separate us and forcing us to identify as ourselves in a certain way. So with this whole movement, what is the way to go? How do I identify myself? I only bring this up because I know when I went to college, I always grew up understanding that concept of what Hawaiian nationalism is, you know. But when in college, I felt like fun because I went there and first I'm not Hawaiian because I'm not Asian. Because I'm not Asian. You know, and there's a lot of Asians from Hawaii that are there and call themselves Hawaiians. And I'm like, oh, they're not Hawaiian. They're like, you know, but in fact, when you think about it, it's like, oh, they're all probably there during that time. And so it's technically not right for me to say I'm Hawaiian. But that's not why they were saying it. They were just saying it because they wanted to say that they were Hawaiian like us, right? You know, they weren't. So where are we now in this idea of how do we identify ourselves and how do I identify myself because that's all I know that I am because that's how we've been taught. I'm Hawaiian. Do I say I'm just cut off from all the way up? But that's the term I use for me. Or what were the terms we started to be more inclusive for all those who are Hawaiian nationals?
The term Hawaiian is actually short for Hawaiian subject, right? Just like American is also short for American citizen. What I think and again, I'm always going to go back to education, right? Because it's not just the Hawaiian national population or even those with ʻokoʻa that need to be educated. It's everybody in Hawaii, right? You call this place home, you also have a responsibility to educate yourself, especially about the history of this place that we call home. But even the term Hawaiian, right? Is Hawaiian a Hawaiian term? Where did they come up with the term Hawaiian? How come we're not called Mauians, or Molokaʻians, or Oahuans? How come we're called Hawaiians? Because of Kamehameha, right? The founder of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the founder of the country that we call the Hawaiian Kingdom came from Hawaiʻi Aloha ʻāina. Right? So if Kamehameha was from Maui, right, we would call ourselves Mauians, but we're not, right? So even just a simple history of where the term Hawaiian comes from is missing from our memories, our understanding, our consciousness, right? Now, those meanings and understandings have been replaced by America's definition of the term Hawaiian, right? Which tries its best to make us compare to or look like Native Americans. The same kind of strategies that they use to basically enslave, kill, Native Americans were strategies that were used here when the occupation began in 1898. Race and those ethnic markers in regard to Hawaii, they become big distractions to us. Right? They become so distracting that not just distractions, but they're also trappings. Right? They trap us into this tight little box that doesn't get us to think beyond that. To think about, first of all, where did this term come from? Right? What did it mean before the occupation began in the 19th century? And how does that relate to us now? Because whenever, today especially, whenever we hear about the Upheavals, Kauai, any of these things, right? Even Department of Hawaiian Homelands, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, the way in which all of these different institutions talk about the term Hawaiian are by definition what the United States created. Right? That does significant damage to us. Right? Because we buy into it. Right? And we start to use kind of those tactics that the United States fed us to be exclusive. Right, towards others. Right? So buying into it has created devastating harm to us. Right? And even more than that, it doesn't allow us to think about a time in which race wasn't the central factor, skin color wasn't a central factor to determine where your home was. Right? At the center of Hawaiian nationality and Hawaiian citizenship in the 19th century wasn't race or ethnicity or skin color, it was allegiance. You had allegiance to the Hawaiian people government, right? What it stood for. You were in that group. You could have a political voice, regardless of the color. It all boiled down to allegiance. Is that kind of get some of what you're saying? And even the term kanaka, right? All of these terms, even that term actually has a legal definition in the Hawaiian Kingdom. Right? And that's a term that's used in the census to refer to a pure-blooded Aboriginal. Right? So even our understanding of that term, and that's what a lot of Hawaiians use today to identify it. I'm Kamehameha. Well, actually, if you look at the definition of the Hawaiian Kingdom, in order for you to be Kamehameha, you have to be someone of pure blood. Right? Even the term hapa was used, that also has a legal definition within the Hawaiian Kingdom and the census. But important to know that we had our own history before the United States happened, right? And it wasn't one that was so connected to race. Because the United States is a very, very, very bad track record when it comes to people of color. Right? They're still trying to figure out that question of race today. We were way beyond that. Even not just race, but even women's rights. Women are allowed to vote in America until about 1920. Now, there's a question of whether or not women were voting in the Hawaiian Kingdom. But one thing that we know is that women in the Hawaiian Kingdom had political voice, political power. We don't have to go farther than the Queen, right? Which is the head of state. The United States is still trying to figure out who the first woman president is going to be, right? But then you even look at people like Hawaiian Campbell. Both are leaders of the Women's Patriotic League who are going around the islands in 1897 to get Hawaiian subjects to sign the anti-annexation petitions, right? Where they get about 40,000. These are women that have political voice, and they're giving political speeches, not just in front of other women, but men as well too, right? So the point being is that we were, with regard to citizenship, with regard to gender and women's rights, with regard to literacy and education, the Hawaiian Kingdom was way ahead of its time in comparison to other countries. It's the United States that puts us into a cave, right? That puts us into a dark room and locks the door. And 100 years later, right, we now found the key. We're now slowly making our way out and saying, wow, who are we? Right? Who are we?
Okay, we have time for one more question. You went a little bit over, then we got we have extra time because we know that there's going to be more questions. So we're going to be here for another 45 minutes after this. We can use that time to go find these guys on the side and ask them questions. We'll have one more question and then we'll close up.
Here, yeah. My question is, okay, so she asked about being Hawaiian blood and all that. Okay, so the natives that came here like prior to Kamehameha or whatever, was their blood all Hawaiian? What were we called as people prior? I mean, you know, it kind of sounds like a lot of what we are. So I don't know, is our blood all Hawaiian? I mean,
in Hawaii, of course, like we said earlier, Hawaiian is an English term. In Hawaii, it's Hawaii. In Kanuha, Hawaii, in the national sense. But before Kamehameha time, we never had a national sense. So I would say, Kauai, I'm Hawaii. And so-and-so is a Oahu. So-and-so is a Niihau. So-and-so is a Hawaii, meaning Hawaiian. And so is a Maui. So it's very specific to our island. So because at the four kingdoms, yeah, so Hawaii Kingdom, Maui Kingdom, Oahu, Kauai. So that was your association. So that person is a Oahu. That person is a Hawaii. And back then, of course, they were English. So we can only speak in terms of Hawaii, Kauai, Oahu, Hawaii, Hawaii. And that had very specific connotations as to what island, and that was essentially, to put it into his terms, their sense of nationality.
If you have any
since the Supreme Court kind of shut down the vote, where do you see, where do you feel, and we're going to affect influx of Hawaiians, of most people that will start wanting to learn?
I don't know where it's going to go from there, but my understanding is, and I could be wrong, because it's still kind of happening right now, it's only temporary, it's only a temporary election. But the funny thing about it, again, from my understanding, I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that they're not shutting it down because of this national question, the national dispute. They're shutting it down because there are legal questions people are raising about that race element, about this thing under the U.S. Constitution. So they're not talking about it in terms of the U.S. versus the Hawaiian. They're keeping it in the U.S. realm, even though the rest of us in this room are getting, hey, that's not the issue. We really need to that's the issue. You know, they're ignoring us, and they're making their own stuff under the realm of the U.S. Constitution. So even this state is temporary until they get past it. The way things are, I thought this thing died. Like remember the deal Biden didn't take it to Colorado? Everybody was shot down. I thought that killed it. Suddenly it's a zombie came back to life. I don't know where it came from. That took me by surprise when it came back. Because I thought it was shut down already. No, it came back because some force is pushing it. It's pushing it no matter. So we get screaming for our life. They still will push them again. Look, the Apaka bill, how much times they try? Monkey, every time. Now we come back again and we call it Kanuha. DOI come, we still shut it down and think monkey again. How much times do you think I'll come back from the dead? So, yeah. People have been wanting, especially Kanuha, have been wanting to speak Hawaiian, and many non-Kanuha are wanting to speak Hawaiian. These days, more and more every time. And I think that is happening even apart from this vote thing. It's happening whether the vote takes place or not. I think so.
And that stage, I think it's a temporary stage, to stay on counting the votes. They haven't shut down the complete process. They're still going ahead, they're still encouraging people to go ahead, fill out the ballot, send it in. We're not going to count them yet. Until the Supreme Court allows us. So that right, to me, that right there gives you all you need to know about how much self there is in this determination. Yeah, this self-determination is based on the allowance of a U.S. Supreme Court judge or state Supreme Court judge. So
there's something involved for the poisonous fruit option. Right?
President's School Doctrine says that you cannot get a legal fruit from an illegal tree. You cannot get a legal fruit from an illegal tree. Anything that grows out from this legal seed, let's say that was planted on August 12, 1898, everything that comes out of that tree, right, is illegal, including the state of Hawaii. And before that, the territory of Hawaii, the state of Hawaii. Right? All of these laws that the United States has been passing in Hawaii since 1898, they all come out of the United States Congress. Simple U.S. constitutional law. U.S. Congress does not have the ability to affect laws in other countries. Right? For example, U.S. Congress cannot change a law in France. U.S. law cannot change a law in Canada. Right? U.S. Congress is all limited to the jurisdiction of the territory. Everything that's come out of all this is
Okay, so that being said, we're gonna wrap up. I'm gonna give it back to Willy. Give a 2-minute wrap up on what you guys want, and then again we'll be here. Please find them, ask questions, talk story, and then we'll have another entertainer comment. So we're gonna get this started. I'm gonna pass it on to Willy. We'll go 2 minutes. Last but not all, we'll wrap this up.
So mahalo for having me. Again, I kind of reiterate what I said when I first started my talk, is that these kinds of events are extraordinary for our ladies and families. And it's all linked back to education. That's the only way, that's the most powerful weapon that we have and that we've ever had. And of course, after Kamehameha put on this field. It's always been education. Right? We've always been able to survive in this place, in Hawaii, because we educated ourselves. You think about the 19th century and how the Hawaiian Kingdom was able to survive, right, amidst the rise of European imperialism in the Pacific, where every other island territory in the world is being conquered. We figured it out because we educated ourselves. And also because we were very diplomatic. We knew how to talk. We knew how to play Konami. We knew how to strategize. We figured out early on that these other countries of the world are much too big to fight against physically. So we needed to come up with other strategies. One of those things was investing in education. Investing in education. This to me is definitely that. Right? Like I mentioned, the people that are running around with James Kauai shirts on. That's huge. 10 years ago, when I was born in 1980, and I did not have access to Punahou, to immersion, to charter schools. All of these different Hawaiian educational institutions were created maybe about 2 or 3 years before I was able to do that. Right? So I missed all of it. I missed Punahou, I missed my immersion, I missed the charter school. Now imagine the kind of conversations or the kind of presentations that are going to happen when these people become my age, 30 years. We're only at the tip of the iceberg. And I think it's important to recognize that. It's important to celebrate. Right? We are going to celebrate. And this idea about ʻokoʻa is definitely something that is becoming much more vivid to us. It's very empowering for us to move forward. So that when these things called Untitled come our way, we are educated enough to break it down, right? To analyze it. To say, wait a second, I don't think that this particular story that's being told in Untitled is the whole story. Right? So, mahalo for Kahoʻokahi for putting on this event, and I would like to call.
When you go fishing on the shore and you throw your line and you get rocks head inside or get the reef and it takes become stuck and start yanking. The bus not going no place because they move the motor, stop the bus park. Air is breath, is air, the air around us is there. Air also means to get up, to rise up. Like when you fall down, air may even to get up. Air is also another word for kuʻokoʻa. Air and kuʻokoʻa are synonymous. Womo ke air ʻokoʻa. And that word air was chosen on purpose for all of these regions. So the air of the ʻāina is mau, ikopono, justice, through equality, through everything being in its right place. That is wrong. When we understand things in the proper context, that is the pono, and it becomes bold every time we get together and talk about it.
Always our two speakers tonight. So I'm gonna end off with a question. How many of us over here celebrate Thanksgiving? Don't lie. I'm not sure whether you guys celebrate Thanksgiving. It's not a trick question. Okay. We all celebrate in some sense, no matter how we justify it. But do we know that, the history of Thanksgiving, especially in the Hawaiian Kingdom, Thanksgiving was used basically to erase ʻāina. And it coincides with the time. It's the last Thursday of November. ʻāina is going to be within maybe 3 days before, 3 days after. And so they used that, and I think this is 1995, about the same year, the year before they banned language out of the schools, 1896, when it comes to legislature. So essentially around the same time, what they did was, okay, so we know about the language, 1896 they banned Hawaiian language out of schools. It's kind of a beginning of banded funding for all of the schools, private, public, in Hawaii. And so it's the beginning in the sense almost of an institutionalized denationalization, Americanization of our people. Another thing that they do is they take out ʻāina. It is no longer a nationally celebrated holiday and replace it with Thanksgiving. Not really they never killed in Hawaii. Yeah, we know that didn't happen. It's a different history. Thanksgiving, that's my understanding, is actually only so much celebrated in America. You have one in Canada, there's something similar, but it's an American holiday. It's an American holiday. We are not, according to recent here, we are not American. We are citizens of the Hawaiian Kingdom. We are nationals. And so, some dual citizens, but what I want to say is, why do we, okay, so we know that history of Thanksgiving is dirty, it's lepo, it's all cool, okay, it's filthy, we still celebrate it. How come? My now is because it's something that's ingrained in us. Because we've done it since we were little kids. None of us here really care about Thanksgiving. We care about getting together with our family. We care about the times that we spend with my favorite cousins, playing games with my favorite aunties and my favorite uncles. It's that time, this is my analysis of it. That's why we find it important. That's why it's special to us. That's why although we know we wasn't pilgrims or Native Americans, that is not our history, and it's not good to celebrate, we still do it because of the feelings that come with it. Because of the history we associate with that, our ohana. All the time, we can't wait 2 more days. And instead of celebrating on Thanksgiving, celebrate on ʻokoʻa. Allow our kids to play with their cousins on those days, allow our aunties and uncles to kind of compete on those days. And after 3-4 years, ʻokoʻa becomes something pretty spectacular, pretty fabulous. And it's something that needs to be ingrained, and that's why I believe it's important for put on these kind of events, because the same way we're trying to get the language we at this time, we need to get all of these other things. We need to normalize these types of actions. But the reason why I love Thanksgiving is because I know it's a time that I can get together with my family. When I was living on Oahu, I would come home and see my mom, and see my dad, and see my brother, and see my auntie, see my uncle, whatever. That's why I love Thanksgiving. And I think that's why I don't love Thanksgiving. That's why I think I love Thanksgiving. Because of that. But again, to think about those things, and it starts to normalize these types of things. What community, because essentially no matter where we come from, this is our community. We all care about the same things, we're fighting for the same things, we're trying to perpetuate the same things. So let's get to know each other and work together. Hallelujah,
Ka ai ka maha o